The paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
Entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Hi, welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. And today my guest is Dr. Michael Salter. And Michael, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, great to be here, Nick. So I'm a criminologist. I'm based here in Sydney at the University of New South Wales. And over the last 15 years, the focus of my research has been on organised child sexual abuse. So where multiple perpetrators conspire to sexually abuse multiple children.
On your website, you said that up to 3% of children that are abused by networks. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there hasn't been a lot of research to investigate how common organised abuse is. So although we have all around the world, large-scale surveys trying to deduce the prevalence of child sexual abuse more generally. Unfortunately, these sorts of epidemiological studies haven't drilled into the question of child sexual exploitation in particular. So some of the data that we have is quite old, and in the late 80s and early 90s in the United Kingdom, there was some work done looking at social work and child protection files, as well as law enforcement files. And what they found was that about 3% of all child sexual abuse cases that were referred to law enforcement and child protection involved allegations of organised abuse. I think, 30 years later, 40 years later, we can suggest that this is probably an underestimate. And the reason why we would suspect that is simply because of the internet and network technology. So, the internet's had a significant impact on patterns of child sexual abuse, and many offenders who in the past would probably have been solo offenders now have extensive opportunities to connect with other offenders and to network with other offenders. So I think there is a real need to dig back into the contemporary data just to get a sense of the extent of socialization and networking between offenders.
I've come to believe that the smartphone has probably created a demand for child pornography because people that otherwise wouldn't have watched that material because of the risks they had to take. If they have a smartphone, they can access it at any time. So it wouldn't surprise me if that part of organized abuse has escalated. And on your website, you said of a survey of 150 survivors, child abuse was found, or they had taken part in child pornography or child abuse material 50% of the time.
Yeah, so this is a survey that was run by the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, which is an organisation that I work with quite closely. And a couple of years ago, they did a survey, it's an international survey of adults who reported that as children they were sexually abused and that child abuse material was made. So they were sexually abused and there was cameras and it was recorded. And what the Canadian Centre found was that 50% of adults who were reporting the manufacture of child sexual abuse material were reporting organised abuse. And so when they dug into the data, and I've done a secondary analysis of that data and published some papers on it, what was interesting was that 80% of those victim survivors were identifying their parents as the primary perpetrators of organised abuse and the manufacture of child abuse material. And what's also interesting about that survey is that it was distributed in multiple languages, and the majority of responses that came back actually weren't in English and weren't from English-speaking countries. And so what this really flags for us is that the production of child sexual abuse material in the context of organised abuse and organised networks is really a global phenomenon that has been suppressed for a very long time, because the reports of parental production of child sexual abuse material really goes back to the 1970s and hasn't been taken seriously until now, because we have the digital evidence in the form of the photos and the videos online.
And you also have a statistic here in Australia, North America, and the United Kingdom that 10 to a third of people seeking mental health practitioners have encountered some type of organized abuse. And
yeah, so there's, sorry.
Go ahead. Well, that's a relatively wide chasm, but could you explain that to us?
So there's been a number of surveys undertaken in Australia and in other countries with therapists, particularly therapists who work in the field of sexual assault or child abuse, but more broadly as well, just psychologists in clinical practice, asking have they encountered a client who discloses a history of organised or ritual abuse. And what these surveys consistently find in multiple countries is that a significant proportion of therapists and clinicians report contact with at least one client. So between 10% to a third, and that variance really just depends on the sample in terms of where the survey's taken place. But what it's really signalling for us is that it's fairly common for mental health practitioners to encounter at least one client who's describing child sexual exploitation. What's also interesting with those surveys is that when the therapists are asked, do you take these reports seriously? Do you think your client is telling the truth? The vast majority of therapists and clinicians find these reports very credible. There's one survey in particular that finds that the more experienced and the more qualified the clinician is, the more likely they are to identify organised or ritual abuse in their caseload. So it really goes against the suggestion that therapists who are working with this population are a minority, that they are unqualified, that they lack experience, that they're making clinical error when they take these clients seriously. Actually, what the evidence suggests is that the more experienced and the more qualified and the longer you're engaged in clinical practice, the more likely you are to identify a client with organised abuse and to take them seriously.
In a couple of the other interviews I've previously done, people weren't identified as DID. They were identified with all kinds of other mental health issues. And it took them a number of therapists before they could find a competent therapist that didn't think that they were bipolar or schizoaffective and give them drugs, but actually started to treat them for DID.
That's right. So particularly where child sexual exploitation is emerging from within the family, so it's not uncommon where parents are, particularly fathers, are sexually abusing their own children, that the abuse may initiate quite early. So kids might not be able to identify the point at which sexual abuse began, because in a sense it's been going on for as long as they can possibly remember. So these are the sorts of scenarios that from a child's point of view are psychologically incredibly hostile, very barren emotionally, sort of the family environment. So the child is forced to take an alternative developmental pathway. So rather than engaging in that normal process of attunement and cohesion as a child develops a core sense of self, children subject to these extremely hostile family environments, very dangerous family environments, are forced down an alternative pathway where they develop dissociation. And what dissociation allows them to do is to continue some normal emotional development, despite the fact that there's other aspects of their psychology that just cannot cohere into a core sense of self. So DID being, quite an adaptive response to early childhood abuse and neglect, but obviously it comes at a significant cost. And
on your website, you've got different types of organized abuse. Let's go through them, and why don't you kind of explicate each one? You start out with network abuse.
So when I talk about network abuse, I'm talking about particularly community-based abuse, so sexual exploitation that occurs outside the family. So the child might be vulnerable for a range of reasons, but the child is being targeted by men in the community. Or the child might be in out-of-home care, for example, and we have a serious issue with kids living in residential care or in other out-of-home care scenarios. So they've been removed from their families. And unfortunately, we have networks of men who predate on those children in particular. Network abuse often shows up with the offender posing as a boyfriend. So the child may initially believe that they simply have a romantic connection with an older person, an adult, at which point the child's manipulated then into sexual exploitation with a wider group of people.
With institutional organized abuse, I wrote the Franklin scandal, and one of the main tributaries for those children was an orphanage, a Catholic orphanage called Boys Town. It's it's a very esteemed orphanage, and it was perpetually supplying the Franklin network with children. And these children were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and dysfunctional families. And these predators were offering them like $500 and to fly them to Washington, D.C. And then they'd be able to make $500, which to them was an enormous amount of money. And the number 2 priest at Boys Town at that point was Father James Kelly, and he was a notorious pedophile. He was molesting kids in upstate New York, and then, unbelievably, the Catholic Church moved him to a Boys Town, an orphanage, where he molested all kinds of kids. I wasn't even looking for Father Kelly victims. I was looking for victims that were caught up in the Franklin scandal, but just about everybody that I talked to that had been sexually abused at Boys Town had been sexually abused by Father Kelly. And then at a certain point, they moved him to Las Vegas to work in a prison. So, and I see that the second category is institutional organized abuse. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, child-focused institutions have been unfortunately very vulnerable to infiltration, particularly by, highly preoccupied and fixated pedophiles who may well, of course, know other offenders. So we have, some very famous cases here in Australia and internationally as well in other jurisdictions, particularly in the 1980s, where children in daycare centres, preschools began to disclose that they were being sexually abused by staff at the preschool or daycare centre, or actually that they were being trafficked out of those institutions for the production of child sex abuse material or for sexual abuse by people outside the network. When these allegations arose in the 1980s, I think there was just a lack of preparedness. It was a real struggle for child protection services, police, the criminal justice system to investigate these cases. Certainly journalists were very skeptical. I think looking back now, we have to acknowledge that these were sectors, the child-focused sort of institutional sectors, that were just open season for sex offenders. And what we now know about sex offenders is that they are highly motivated and will, in fact, build their entire professional career around accessing children. In the late 1980s here in Australia, we had a preschool on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria that was closed by government inquiry. And the government inquiry concluded that the preschool had been set up for the purpose of sexually exploiting children. Now, no charges were actually laid against the preschool operators on the basis that the children were actually too young to testify or to provide evidence in a criminal court. Whereupon actually those daycare operators fled interstate. And some years later, once the internet emerged around 1996, they then published the names and the addresses of all of those complainant children in an act of retaliation. So we've got some quite egregious sorts of cases here in Australia as well. In 2008, we had a public inquiry into sexual abuse in one of our states in South Australia. It was called the Mulligan Inquiry. And on the first page of the Mulligan report, Commissioner Mulligan actually refers to what he calls pedophile parties that were being thrown with children in out-of-home care. And he identified a pattern whereby networks of offenders in the city of Adelaide were trafficking children They had staff that were based in residential settings, trafficking children out of the institution and to homes where men were waiting. There would be a dinner party, the children would be drugged and then sexually abused. What's interesting is that in Australia, these reports get made, they get affirmed by government inquiry and public inquiry, and yet somehow they never hit the front page. There's no public outrage, there's no wider response to this pattern of sexual exploitation. And actually, my country still doesn't have a coherent policy framework around child sexual exploitation. These reports get made and very little gets done about it.
Australia put together the Royal Commission to look into sexual abuse and who are the greatest offenders and where the kids were most vulnerable. Do you think that commission did a good job, or do you think that it could have done a better job, or what are your thoughts about the Royal Commission?
So for your listeners, the Royal Commission is the most authoritative public inquiry that can be constituted under Australian legislation. So a Royal Commission has significant powers, including the ability to subpoena evidence and subpoena witnesses to testify. So the Royal Commission ran from 2013 to 2017. It was specifically an inquiry into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So it was looking at institutional abuse. It really came about through the mobilisation of survivors of clergy sexual abuse. But it didn't just look at sexual abuse in religious settings. It also looked at sexual abuse in schools, in out-of-home care, and so on. The budget actually for the Royal Commission was $500 million. So it really was an extraordinarily expansive and well-resourced undertaking. And it did an amazing job, actually. It specifically targeted institutional settings and selected a number of case studies where they really sort of drilled into institutional responses. So, I mean, on the whole, did a fantastic job, made some great recommendations. We're still waiting to see the full implementation of those recommendations. There was a couple of case studies that were really interesting where sexual exploitation did take place or was found to have taken place in institutional settings. So we had a diocese in my state of an Anglican diocese where the apparatus of the Anglican Church over a period of 50 years was infiltrated by pedophile priests. And essentially the diocese was run by a clique of child sex offenders for 2 generations. And they would abuse boys. They would then encourage those boys to take up positions in the diocese as adults. And then those former victims would then start abusing as well. So it did some really good work, I think, unearthing how complicated child sexual exploitation can be and how long some of these networks can last for. Do I think that the Royal Commission got to the heart of the issue of sexual exploitation? Absolutely not.
And it did set up some recommendations for implementation. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Look, really broad-based recommendations across the system, so across criminal justice, across child protection, across mental health. Some of the criminal justice recommendations have been about removing some of the barriers that survivors experience in the criminal justice system and removing some of the black letter law issues that exclude relevant evidence from child sexual abuse trials. So those have been broadly implemented. It's also, we're just establishing now a National Centre of Excellence around child sexual abuse in the country. So a peak body around child sexual abuse that's got a real focus on representing the rights and needs of adult survivors. So some of that infrastructure is being established now and is being bedded in. So it's going to take a little while to see what the long-term effect is. We also, in the aftermath of the Royal Commission, we now have at a national level, under the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, we have a National Office for Children's Safety. So it really just underscores that prior to the Royal Commission, Australia just had no coordinating agencies, collaborative agencies operating at a national level to ensure the protection of children from child sexual abuse. That's changing, and it's extraordinary that it's taken so long to get these agencies set up. But we're still, I think, waiting to see what the impact of those agencies is going to be on child safety and also on the well-being of adult survivors.
The UK set up a similar type of commission, and there was a tremendous amount of controversy about it, that it didn't augur really into the issue. And but I've heard positive things about the Australian Royal Commission, much more positive than I've heard about the UK Commission.
Look, the Royal Commission in Australia had an incredible budget, and one of the things that meant was that they set up an entire sort of support architecture for survivors, and they were incredibly sensitive in the way that they worked with survivors and supported survivors. There was also bipartisan support for the Royal Commission, so across the political spectrum. In the UK, what happened with the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse is that, immediately prior to its establishment, the then Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, said, "I think that this is a waste of time." The current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said that he thought that the money that was being spent was just, he said, being faffed up the wall, which I think translates out of UK slang into being pissed up the wall. And so to say that there was a lack of leadership around the independent inquiry is to put it quite mildly. There was then a series of controversies because the chair people that they kept appointing to head the inquiry were very august members of the British aristocracy who happened to have family and professional and personal links with men under suspicion of child abuse as part of the independent inquiry, which tells you something about the class structure of the United Kingdom and the way in which that class structure has been implicated in the abuse of really vulnerable kids. They also just didn't have the funding to do the sort of sensitive survivor-focused work that they needed to do. The current chair of the inquiry is a very well-respected social work professor who has actually previously overseen inquiries into organised and ritual abuse and done a fantastic job. And I think she's stabilised the inquiry. They recently released a report into child sexual exploitation, but solely focused on sexual exploitation in institutional settings. And I think that just speaks to the way that the issue of sexual exploitation keeps being fragmented. And there's just a failure to look at the entire spectrum of sexual exploitation of children.
That organized network in the UK probably went as high as the Prime Minister, Ted Heath. And I've written about it.
It's been a bumpy ride in the UK over the last 10 or 15 years. And there's been a number of substantive allegations made against, of course, the former Prime Minister, Ted Heath. In that case, there was actually dozens of adults who came forward independently describing sexual offences by the former PM. I mean, essentially that inquiry really went nowhere. And Ted Heath is not the only kind of august individual in the UK where these allegations have been made and really not put to bed in any sufficient way. And there's a range of reasons for that, but also, frankly, the United Kingdom media, especially the newspapers of record, have been very hostile to these allegations against high-profile individuals. And from an editorial point of view, have taken a very, very skeptical line against victims and survivors.
I will return to the media at some point. And could you tell us a little bit about familial organized abuse?
So a lot of my work, a lot of my research work is done with survivors who describe particularly their fathers, but also sometimes their mothers, who were severely sexually violent at home and were also involved in networks of offenders that could include members of their extended family, often overlapping with other families that also sexually abused their children. And so parents are probably the largest category of perpetrator that's consistently identified by organised abuse survivors. So that's in no way to downplay the seriousness of institutional abuse, but certainly it's parents that we consistently hear about from survivors of organised abuse. And this is just, it's a type of perpetrator that's been overlooked by the criminal justice system and by forensic psychology for a long time, because it's actually very difficult to identify familial sexual abuse generally. And these are very difficult cases to prosecute because your primary witness is the person who loves the offender more than anything in the world, and is also severely damaged and psychologically injured by the abuse. So familial organised abuse is also where we see a lot of sadistic abuse. So these parental perpetrators tend to be quite sadistic. They often have a number of other forms of sexual deviancy. It's not uncommon that this victim group discloses a range of other really horrific sexual offences against them, such as bestiality and so on. So one of the issues that's really moved the dial for me professionally has been increased state concern around child sexual abuse material online. And what we know is that the most highly trafficked, the most in-demand images and videos online that every offender is looking for and collects is of the sexual abuse of very young girls, often 4, 5, and 6, by their fathers. And so, unfortunately, it's taken the accumulation of this digital evidence in both photo and video, and also what we see on the dark web, to really turn the attention of police and state authorities to the fact that parents and fathers are really integral to the traffic in children.
Well, I've heard accounts of children that were badly abused in their family, and they're taken out of the family home, and the children their biggest concern is getting back to see their parents. And that doesn't, people in social services don't really understand that type of psychological dynamic. And you kind of talk about it where those perpetrators, those kids, they know no other way. And consequently, they love their parents, even though their parents are absolute monsters.
Look, all children, of course, are deeply attached to their parents. But in fact, particularly this victim group, because they are terrified, they are frightened, and one of the terrible ironies of familial sexual abuse is that the child's needs escalate dramatically as a result of the sexual abuse, and then they turn to the perpetrator to have those needs met because the perpetrator is their parent. And so we see this cycle whereby the child becomes increasingly enmeshed, and it becomes very difficult. Even as the child grows, becomes a teenager or an adult, it becomes very difficult for the child to individuate from the abusive parent in the healthy way that children will individuate from their parents. And so, in fact, for this victim group, if the abuse is detected and they are removed from their families, they might be placed in foster care or in residential care. This victim group as teenagers will abscond, and they will, in fact, run back to their family home, where they will then continue to be severely sexually abused. And unfortunately for this victim group, that's really common in their 20s and 30s and 40s, that they will continue to be abused by this terrorizing family. Even though one part of them very much wants that abuse to end, there's another part that's very dependent upon their family.
And then they often become perpetrators themselves.
Well, it really depends. So certainly I've done work with both men and women who talk about as adults the fact that, yes, they also offended against kids. We also have perpetrators who will blackmail, particularly women, so organised abuse survivors who have their own kids. and they'll use those children, they'll threaten those children. So they will threaten to sexually abuse those children if the woman does not continue to comply with demands for sexual abuse. But of course, I only speak to and I only interview the survivors who break away. And so presumably, and it would make sense that, you know, the survivors who don't break away, who remain enmeshed in those networks, are, you know, very likely to be engaged in sexual offending against children.
And you also list ritual abuse as a form of organized abuse. Could you talk to us about that?
So ritual abuse is really sort of an overlapping category of abuse. It's not separate to the other forms of organized abuse that we've been describing, but it involves the misuse of rituals in the sexual exploitation of children. You know, this is really the most controversial allegation of child sexual abuse that you can possibly raise, and we don't need to rehearse the controversies around ritual abuse. But it's worth recognizing that we have a range of criminal cases involving multiple convicted sex offenders where ritualistic activity, including deviant Christian abuse and deviant abuse of other religious varieties, was substantiated in criminal investigation. So there is absolutely no doubt that ritual abuse takes place. And it is a marker of the most severe forms of child maltreatment.
Ritual abuse has been very tainted. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation went on the offensive against ritual abuse, well, against every type of child abuse. And consequently, the media fell in line. And do you see it getting less controversial as time goes on? Once we see more and more of it and begin to understand it?
I think what we know now about sex offenders is, and what we know now about cultures of child sexual abuse, is that sex offenders will use a range of cultural resources to justify their sexual abuse of children. A key part of the dynamic of ritual abuse is the constitution of the child victim as evil, as degraded. The child is, you know, possessed by demons or possessed by Satan, and that the child deserves what the offenders are doing. So this is a very classic process of projection whereby the people abusing children deny that they have any responsibility for the abuse and project that abuse onto the child. And so the ritual and the religious sort of context to the abuse is very powerful way of forcing the child to feel like what's being done to them is justified because there's something fundamentally sort of wrong with them. And so when ritual abuse emerged as an issue really unexpectedly in the 1980s, we just did not have the knowledge that we have now about the way that child sexual abuse works. And so we recognize now in a way that we didn't even recognize, I think, 10 years ago, that child abusers work in groups, that they create cultures that justify their abusing, and that religion can be part of that justification. I've interviewed dozens of people describing ritual abuse. For about a third of those survivors, they actually come from fundamentalist Christian backgrounds. So they come from faith backgrounds where there's a belief in Satan as a very active force in daily life. Satan is seen as, you know, directly implicated in sexuality. And so in a sense, it makes a lot of sense that networks of offenders in those communities would be drawing on the idea of sort of Satan and perverse sexuality, and that they would be drawing on religious iconography to justify what they do. It's actually quite common that we hear about ritual abuse in these sort of fundamentalist Christian backgrounds that already believe in spirits and demons. It's just not that surprising that offenders would use that framework to justify their abuse.
It never ceases to amaze me how offenders will use anything to justify their abuse. I've been in this world for about 20 years, and it never ceases to amaze me. And you also talked about technology facilitated organized abuse.
That's right. So, I mean, obviously, it's no grand surprise now over the last 25 years that the internet has provided child abusers with a range of opportunities to connect with one another and also to find new child victims and also to use the internet to distribute the material that they make when they abuse children and to broadly kind of surveil and terrorize the children that they are abusing. So the internet and technology is interwoven now with patterns of child sexual abuse, and that is true of organized abuse. So we will see organized networks form online, and the dark web and Tor now supports communities of offenders numbering in their millions. We are talking about millions, if not tens of millions, of pedophiles who are now networked through the dark web. And also, the internet provides infrastructure for offenders who are abusing in a face-to-face context, so networks of offenders on the ground. The internet provides them with a range of facilities and opportunities to amplify their offending.
And your last category is child sexual abuse material.
So, I mean, child sexual abuse material, I'm just going to say CSAM from now on because it's just easier to say, is really ubiquitous across organised abuse. So for as long as children have been disclosing networks of offenders that meet to abuse children, they've been describing the use of cameras and videos to record that abuse. We suspect that the majority of CSAM is made for either personal use or for local circulation. I think sometimes there's a view that when offenders are recording abuse, they're immediately uploading it to the internet for everyone else. That's not the case. So child sexual abuse material or CSAM is now so prevalent online, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of images and videos that essentially it's become a national security issue because cyber infrastructure is just swamped in illegal content, and the systems that have been set up to detect and remove that content are just not able to operate at the same scale that perpetrators are operating at when they promulgate that material. So this is now just a global emergency, and we're seeing, my government and the United States and governments all around the world really change their posture on the issue of CSAM because it cannot continue in this way. So I do a lot of work in that space, looking at the detection and removal of CSAM, but also supporting victims and survivors whose content has been really widely distributed, and victims and survivors whose material has been shared, report being stalked by CSAM offenders. They report being blackmailed with the material. We have both children and adults who are spending time every day trying to find their images and videos and trying to report them for takedown. It really is just an absolute mess that's been allowed to accumulate over the last 20, 25 years.
And how do we even begin to tackle something like that?
So there's a few ways to go about it. I mean, firstly, it starts with regulation. Because in the 1990s, there was this complacency about the issue of sexual exploitation. The media, by and large, had dismissed allegations of sexual exploitation. There was the sense that there wasn't a great deal of demand for child sexual abuse material. And so when the internet was commercialized in 95, 96, there was no safeguards put around the internet to ensure that illegal content couldn't proliferate. And so there's a real need for regulation. And in the United States, we've seen the Earn It Act has garnered a lot of momentum, and we're quite optimistic that it will pass next year. And what the Earn It Act would do would be to hold internet service providers criminally and civilly liable if their services are being used to distribute child sexual abuse material. There are existing technological solutions in order to identify and remove CSAM. And unfortunately, technology companies choose not to implement that technology, despite the fact that it's free, because they're not required to. And so what the Earn It Act will do is actually force technology companies to take responsibility for the illegal content that is being traded on their services. But more broadly, we need to take seriously how extensive the interest in the bodies of children is. And we have pretty good data to suggest that about 4% of men in the community have intentionally viewed sexual abuse images of prepubescent children. And that also means creating support services for victims and survivors. And at the moment, there is no specialist service for victims and survivors whose abuse has been recorded and distributed online.
What I find mind-boggling is Pornhub, which I think is the largest pornography platform on the internet. They've been busted over 100 times with child pornography. Over 100 times. I think it's 117 times. And they keep going. I mean, the United States has, we have to crack down on that. I mean, these platforms need to vet the people that the exploitation, who are getting exploited. And if they're minors, I kind of feel that if they get busted once, it should be one and done with those type of platforms, but they just keep doing it.
What's extraordinary is that the legal frameworks established around the internet by the United States government indemnifies internet service providers for third-party content. So because the child sexual exploitation videos that have been uploaded multiple times to Pornhub over a long period of time is uploaded by their users and isn't being uploaded by Pornhub, the company. Therefore, under United States legislation, actually those companies are not responsible for that content and for the harm of that content, despite the fact that they profit from it because they run advertising on it and they also make money from the number of users that this content attracts. So there's been a crackdown on Pornhub because they've been exposed for this behavior. One of the things that pulled Pornhub into line is that the banks that were providing payment systems to Pornhub threatened to withdraw payment services from Pornhub because banks and financial institutions are much more tightly regulated than internet service providers. And if banks are found to be complicit in child sexual exploitation, and if it's found that their services are being used to facilitate child sexual exploitation, they face billion-dollar fines. So in my country, Westpac, the bank Westpac, was found to be facilitating payment for live streaming of abuse out of the Philippines. And was subject to I believe it was a $1.2 billion fine. It was the largest corporate fine in Australian history. So banks are much more tightly regulated than internet service providers. But I can tell you, and I've seen the data, Pornhub is not the only top 10 pornography site company that is hosting known child sexual abuse material. All of them are hosting that material.
I just find it mind-boggling that Pornhub with, busted 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 40 times, 50 times, they just keep going. And it doesn't say a lot about the United States and how we perceive our children. I mean, to let Pornhub continually break the law like that.
But it's interesting. So interrupting, but it's interesting, when we look at something like the Franklin scandal and when we look at a range of scandals in which children have been severely sexually exploited, and, our impetus is to think, well, somehow, these systems, that are set up to protect children, they must be being overridden. Now, of course, there are conspiracies to sexually abuse children. I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's not. But I think what the situation with Pornhub and some of the issues we've been describing today underscore is that for people who do conspire to sexually abuse children, it's not as though they're working against a significant counterweight. It's not as though there's a significant counterforce that opposes them. They're essentially just stepping over the very, very low barriers to entry that we have created around the sexual abuse of children. What Pornhub really illustrates is that a multi-billion-dollar company, one of the largest internet service providers in the world, the combined traffic of Pornhub is extraordinary, is able to host content that sexually exploits children over a period of years. We knew that they were doing that. Victims were complaining for years. The media ignored it until the last couple of years, and authorities ignored it, including authorities that are set up in order to take reports of sexual exploitation. By and large, we're not ringing the alarm bells on the Pornhubs of this world until, frankly, the New York Times started putting it on the front page.
Yeah, it was long overdue. I'm glad that the New York Times did that. And when we talk about the Franklin scandal, it was definitely all these categories: network abuse, institutional organized abuse, familial organized abuse, ritual abuse, and child sexual abuse material. The Franklin scandal had all of those. We've talked a little bit about the media and how the media has been somewhat apathetic. Definitely what we saw in the UK was there was a lot of attention that was shown on Jimmy Savile, but there was very little attention that was shown on Sir Peter Heyman. He was, I guess, the leader of the pedophile information exchange. And from what I understand, he was the number 3 guy at MI6. The Guardian reported that. And what we saw there was just, I think, a complete abrogation of journalistic responsibility, because there was a pretty huge scandal there that had been covered up, and Margaret Thatcher had helped cover it up. And what we're seeing now in the United States with Jeffrey Epstein is, I think, something very similar. We know who a lot of the predators are with Jeffrey Epstein, these other predators. And the media just likes to dig up salacious dirt, but no one is calling for any kind of justice in the media. And I just find that remarkably egregious, that the media is so apathetic. And I'm hoping that there can be some kind of miracle where all these child molesters that were in cahoots with Jeffrey Epstein will eventually get sentenced to prison where they belong. But the media isn't facilitating that. I don't see, the government isn't facilitating that. The media isn't facilitating that. And I don't see anti-trafficking organizations trying to facilitate that. So all these victims are getting let down by, they should be protected by the government. They should be protected by the media. They should be protected by anti-trafficking organizations. But there's just either salacious curiosity or complete neglect. And what are your thoughts about the Jeffrey Epstein network and how it's been covered up in the United States of America?
I mean, I think the term that you used there around just this abrogation of journalistic responsibility really captures the broad-based failure of journalism as a profession over a period of decades when it comes to complex sexual abuse allegations. The mainstream media in the 1990s made an egregious error in the way in which the profession took a stance actually against the credibility of sexual abuse allegations from the early 1990s, and really embedded into the profession a deep strain of skepticism when it comes to both children and adults who are describing really egregious sexual abuse. Now, the tide starts to turn, of course, with the Boston Herald in their expose of clergy abuse in the early noughties, and journalists start to realize that there might be Pulitzers and there might be prizes if they do start to investigate clergy abuse. And we start to see a change in the tone of journalism. I agree with you. I think Jimmy Savile was another key turning point, because what it underscored to the media and also to the public at large was that offenders could offend over a period of decades blatantly, obviously. I mean, in some cases, Savile offended against minors while being recorded for his own TV appearances, and nobody did anything about that. And And so you've seen this sort of expansion of public imagination about what's possible when it comes to child sexual abuse. But Epstein's a really interesting one because, you know, the breadcrumbs were all there, and the stench around his sweetheart deal when he was first charged was pungent, let's put it that way, and a stark lack of media curiosity around him and around those first round of charges. And then, you know, there's all of this, you know, we have then journalists throwing up their hands and saying, why are there all these conspiracy theories? And, you know, where did Pizzagate come from? Well, Pizzagate emerged in a vacuum. It emerged in a vacuum that the media left around very credible allegations around high-profile individuals, and the media chose not to follow up those allegations. The public looked for an explanation, and we start to see conspiracy theories. And yes, of course, Pizzagate is outlandish and ridiculous, etc. But the media creates very fertile territory for these sorts of conspiratorial movements when they choose to ignore and they choose not to follow up facts that are on the public record. And the public expects the media to do its job.
I was telling you earlier about an Atlantic monthly article that basically said that child trafficking, fake is the word that the article used. And I wrote the author of the article, and I gave her some links, and she never got back to me. So I don't know if I made a dent in her convictions or not. But when I see articles like that from the media, it's really appalling. And what Epstein has shown me is that pedophiles, from coast to coast, can be covered up in broad daylight in the United States of America, and with the help of the media, the government and the media working together. And I was at the Epstein or the Maxwell trial, and I saw all these new news organizations from all over the world taking it seriously. I mean, Maxwell trafficked children for over 25 years, and she was only indicted on one count of child trafficking. And we know who a number of the other procurers were, the pimps, like Sarah Kelland. They weren't indicted. We know who a number of the perpetrators are. They weren't indicted. And these people in the media were treating it like it was an actual story. I mean, I was really stunned. People would put on their makeup and make sure that their teeth were clean, and then they'd get the light on them, and then they report about the Maxwell trial and how we're getting justice for Jeffrey Epstein's victims. I found it really appalling.
I think there is I don't want to excuse the failures here, but I do think there's a kind of a psychological mechanism at work here whereby people find it really difficult in both public, you know, just members of the community, but also professionals, to hold all of these pieces together, because, you know, how do you kind of maintain your faith in the architecture of government and the orderly nature of society? And yet at the same time, we have this criminal substratum that is able to operate and flourish quite openly, you know, in your city, in your town, in your community, in your country, committing egregious sexual offences against children, and all of the systems that are supposedly in place to protect children and hold perpetrators accountable, they easily slip through those nets. The fact is that when the sexual abuse of children became public knowledge in the 1980s, no government really set up the infrastructure that was necessary to keep children safe. The 1980s and the 1990s was a time of where, you know, governments were seeking to actually shrink the public service and shrink the social safety net. They were not interested in creating a new workforce. And so in a sense, we're still grappling with the problem of child sexual abuse and exploitation in a way where we are grossly under-resourced, grossly underfunded, and government, in a sense, hasn't endowed itself with the powers that it needs to proactively protect children from offenders who are proactively looking to predate on children. We're still in the same situation that we were 40 years ago.
Well, it's interesting. We have made some strides, but it's still very, very far off in the distance. And to address all these issues, these types of abuses that we've talked about. And although, as I said, people are starting to understand it more, we're still miles away from where we need to be. How do you think that we can close this gap? I mean, we saw it with the Australian Royal Commission, and what are your thoughts about closing this gap?
Look, I mean, my last statement was probably sounds quite pessimistic. I mean, what I would say, because I mean, I do actually quite a lot of work at the government level. And as much as I think that there is a dawning realization in the community about the extent of this problem, I've also seen an absolute sea change at the government level and the public service level in terms of realizing the scope of this problem, and also the development of considerable will to try to tackle this. I know that in Australia, we've seen a lot of resources flow into a much more strategic, collaborative, coordinated approach to child abuse. And I'm actually quite optimistic about the changes that we're seeing in Australia. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be in a really different position. But I mean, that's also true in the United States, the United Kingdom. It's just taken so long for that sea change to occur. And I think that wait has been incredibly frustrating. And as we've been waiting, more and more children have been damaged. I think we're getting to the starting line of this race now. And that's really terrible to think that it's taken us so long to build that political will and that social awareness.
I started looking into Jeffrey Epstein in 2010, and I made my first sojourn to Florida in 2012, and I acquired his black book and a lot of police documentation. And I came back here and I was unable to sell an article about Jeffrey Epstein, completely unable to sell an article. And I was thinking to myself, if one of those media outlets who I pitched an Epstein article to had actually published an article and something had been done, Epstein would have, scores of children would have been saved from abuse. But I was just a voice in the wilderness talking about Jeffrey Epstein. And I thought when I published his black book on the internet in 2015 that there would be some momentum, but no, it was there wasn't any momentum. And I was kind of stunned by that. Really, I was despondent for a while. I'm still despondent, but at that point I was very despondent. And
our libel laws in Australia make this kind of reporting almost impossible. We've had fairly mild inferences of sexual misconduct that have been, quite aggressively prosecuted through the civil system in relation to libel and defamation. So I certainly appreciate, your libel and defamation laws are not quite as ridiculous as ours are. But I do appreciate from an editorial point of view that, reporting allegations against, frankly, high profile and wealthy individuals, does kind of raise the hairs on the back of the neck of media organizations because they know that they're taking a significant risk. But at the same time, the allegations against Epstein were public knowledge. There was a clear argument for the public right to know and the public good around those allegations. And as you say, when the media fails to investigate and follow up on these loose threads, children get abused. And I think that there's a real lack of media accountability and self-reflection on some of the complicity of the media in the sexual abuse of children, because the media fails to do its job when it comes to some of these allegations. And it fails to treat the abuse of children as its core business. And frankly, perpetrators know that, and it's a loophole that they exploit.
Do you think that Australia as a society is much further along in addressing this, both from the government and the media, than the United States?
Look, to a certain extent, yes. And yet I also know that there's very good work that's done in the United States, particularly around online sexual exploitation of children, that my government is learning from. And, we are trying to adapt what we do to some of the good practice in the United States. So, I think the Royal Commission has been incredibly helpful for us. I think our media is also more friendly to some of this reporting than we've seen overseas. But it also is a global problem, and governments are learning from one another. Some governments take a step forward in law reform, or they will fund a particular agency or institution, and then other governments will learn from that. So it's a slow process of reform, but it is happening, I will say.
I'm a journalist, and I've been utterly disgusted by my fellow journalists in the United States to take this issue on. And I think Epstein was a shining example of the apathy of the media. And as I said earlier, the media seemed to be into digging up salacious dirt. There wasn't a call, as far as I know, from any of the media to protect the children by holding the perpetrators accountable. And I don't get that, that the media can be so compromised or incompetent. Earlier I said abrogation of journalistic standards. So at this point, I'm still somewhat optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't have written the Franklin scandal and gone after Epstein if I wasn't somewhat optimistic that something could happen. But I do have my moments of despondency.
I mean, I think a book like the Franklin scandal is a really important point of accountability. I think that we need to, go back and look at these cases from the 80s and the 90s and insist on the facticity of what took place and have a clear-sighted view on what we know and what we can conclude and what we don't know. Because my concern is that as we enter into this new era, and I think we are entering into a different space around child sexual exploitation, that there will be a kind of a loss of memory, a convenient loss of memory that says, oh, well, Franklin or McMartin or whatever, yeah, those were false allegations, but these allegations are true. And I appreciate that there are people like yourself, Nick, and I think there are other people doing some of this work to say, no, these allegations always had substance to them. And we need to be honest about the institutional failures and the journalistic failures and the failures of government. I mean, ultimately, it is the responsibility of the state to protect these children. It's, the media has a role, but where was the state and where were those failures there? Because, I mean, that's ultimately where we need to be holding some feet to the fire and making sure that our governments are doing the job that the community expects them to do, which is to make sure that children are not being subject to egregious sexual trafficking and exploitation with no consequence.
There was a professor at Brown University who wrote a book called The Witch Hunt Narrative. And his name is Rashid. I think that's his name. I always get mix up the pronunciation of his last name, which kind of rhymes with a four-letter word. So I hope I didn't do that. But anyway, he went back. He spent 15 years on that book. Are you familiar with The Witch Hunt Narrative?
Yes, I know Ross quite well, and his book is really fantastic.
And he went over all the satanic panic issues in the or cases in the 80s and early 90s, and he showed in the vast majority of them there were children that were sexually abused, and I read that book and I was overcome with emotion that he had done this incredible thankless task.
I mean, what's really interesting about Ross's book, I mean, it really is an extraordinary forensic analysis of these cases. And again, Ross is just paying attention to what's on the public record, what was the evidence that was adduced at trial. So if we take the McMartin case, we have medical evidence of sexual assault to an undeniable certainty. There's no denying that children in that case were raped. And what's incredible is that journalists in their retrospective covering of that case, so at the time when they were covering it, they reported it correctly. In the retrospective revisioning of that case, that the torn bodies of toddlers is just expunged from journalistic interest. There's no interest in what happened to those children. There's just an interest in a particular kind of very flat, very generic narrative about false allegations and so on. And in fact, that narrative around McMartin gets more and more generic and blurry and uncertain over time as journalists just recruit McMartin into their reporting as a kind of symbol. They're not interested in it as an actual case anymore. And I honestly don't know how people go to bed and sleep at night when you're referring in such an offhand way to a case where you have children's bodies being torn up by what has been done to them sexually, and you just throw that out the window. You're not interested in the well-being of those children because you have an argument to make, and it's convenient for you to ignore the forensic evidence. And we've seen that time and time again. And this continues to the present day in the way that the media covers these high-profile cases in the 80s and the 90s. And it just goes back to the point that we've raised around media accountability. I mean, this is appallingly unethical behaviour, and it's become normal in the way that journalists cover child sexual abuse.
Am I getting his last name right? Chiat?
Ross, if you're listening, I apologise. I think it's Chait.
Chait? Okay.
I think it's Chait. I'm sorry, Ross.
Chait? Okay. Hopefully I didn't offend him. I read that book, and as I said, I was really stunned with the research that he had shown that all these cases that had just been written off, there were actually children that were sexually abused. And look, if he hadn't written that book, all those cases would just be thought of as fanciful fabrications. It's quite amazing.
And yet people continue to talk about those cases in the way that they always have with, I mean, if they bothered to do the research, they would come across Ross's book, they would read it, they would be forced to change their narrative. They either ignore the book or they read it and they choose to ignore its undeniable conclusions, because frankly, those conclusions are inconvenient. And I think that's an extraordinary illustration of how invested some commentators are in this witch hunt narrative that says that children can't be trusted and adult survivors have unreliable testimony. And they will hold that view regardless of the evidence because it is an ideology. And it's an ideology that some people in the media and in academia have invested their careers in. And it's a belief that some people need to hold for their own personal reasons, it seems.
Michael, I want to thank you so much for coming to the Nick Bryant Podcast.
Absolute pleasure, Nick.
It's been great interviewing you, and it's nighttime for me and morning for you. You've probably got a big day ahead of yourself. I hope you have a good day. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.